In the darkest passages of Rome's history, few stories are as unsettling as that of Sporus, a young man whose fate was shaped by the decisions of one of the most controversial emperors in history, Nero. This tale not only speaks of power and dominion but also of how unchecked passions can transform lives in inhumane ways. The story of Sporus is not just a tale of politics or kingdoms, it is a reminder of the limits of power and what happens when a human being loses their freedom and identity. Today we explore the story of Sporus, a young man whose life was altered by the empire, on a dark journey of identity, power, and the struggle to survive. In a world where obsession and the loss of humanity go hand in hand, how far can an emperor go to satisfy his desires? To understand the tragedy of Sporus, we must first look at Nero's reign, a man whose figure has been marked by controversy and chaos. Nero came to power as a young emperor, heir to a great dynasty, but quickly became known for his extravagant behaviors and emotional instability. From his early years on the throne, Nero shocked Rome with his love for luxury and opulence. His life was filled with extravagant public spectacles, such as his performances on stage, and ambitious construction projects, like his monumental Domus Aurea, the Golden House. All of this took place while Rome lived under his rule, enjoying superficial peace, but tensely awaiting what was to come. However, Nero's reign was not limited to the pursuit of personal glory. The first signs of his growing instability began to emerge as rumors spread about his unpredictable temper and the consequences of his erratic decisions. Nero surrounded himself with people who would please him, but soon dissenting voices began to rise louder. At the imperial court, amid splendor and decadence, a dark story was beginning to unfold. And in the midst of this turbulent reign, Sporus emerged, a young man who would capture Nero's attention due to his remarkable beauty. What happened next would not only mark the life of Sporus but also a sinister turn in the history of one of the most perplexing emperors Rome has ever known. At some point during Nero's reign, a young slave named Sporus began to attract the emperor's attention. Described by historians as exceptionally beautiful, Sporus possessed an almost ethereal grace, which made him stand out among the servants and the Roman elite. Although Sporus was free, his position remained precarious. In Imperial Rome, the lives of those within the emperor's court were not truly safe. If the emperor desired something, that person had no choice but to obey. What happened next was as strange as it was disturbing. Nero, devastated by the death of his wife, Pompeia Sabina, began showing signs of deep emotional distress. It was said that the queen had died under mysterious circumstances, and Nero's sadness soon turned into obsession. It was then that he saw Sporus, a young man who, according to some, resembled Pompeia so closely that he appeared to be a reincarnation of the late empress. This fascination with Sporus was not a mere superficial desire. Nero, in his pain and confusion, began to see the young man as a replacement for the woman he had lost. What started as an obsession soon transformed into a dangerous demand. Nero, in his delirium, decided that Sporus must be completely transformed to fulfill the role he had devised. Nero ordered his doctors to castrate Sporus, a decision that was not only physical but also psychological, an act that erased his identity and humanity in order to make him the living image of Pompeia. This brutal act was not just a mutilation but an attempt to erase all individuality from Sporus to create a version of the person Nero had lost. What followed was a process that stripped Sporus of everything he had been. Once castrated, the young man was forced to accept a new identity, that of Pompeia. The emperor, wishing to restore his image of the lost wife, began to forge a new existence for Sporus, not as a free human being but as a distorted reflection of someone who could never be replaced. Sporus, whose name was changed to Sabina, became Nero's reborn wife, forced to undergo the public marriage rituals as though she were Pompeia herself. She appeared before Rome wearing the clothes and jewels of the deceased empress, parading through the streets in a kind of ceremony that was more of a spectacle than a real union. The Romans, accustomed to their emperor's whims, witnessed this scene with a mixture of repulsion and curiosity. But the most disturbing thing of all was that Sporus was not merely acting. It was not a theatrical performance, but an imposed life. Nero didn't just want Sporus to behave like Pompeia, he forced him to be Pompeia. Every gesture, every word had to be perfect, a reflection of the empress who was no longer there. Any slip, any mistake, could provoke Nero's wrath, who tolerated no imperfection in his own vision of the world. What had been a life full of hope for Sporus quickly became a prison from which he could not escape. In private, he was treated with a mixture of affection and cruelty by Nero. In public, he was expected to be the perfect image of Pompeia, the woman he could never replace. As Sporus was forced to play the role of Nero's new wife, the psychological manipulation he endured reached unimaginable levels. At the Roman court, where luxury and ostentation were the norm, Sporus lived under Nero's absolute control. Despite the apparent displays of affection from the emperor, every gesture, every word, was designed to reaffirm his control. Sporus was not free to be himself. He could not behave as he wished, nor did he have space to express his desires or emotions. He was ordered to walk, speak, and behave like Pompeia, as if his own identity were a garment that could be changed at will. Any mistake in his performance was severely punished, creating a destructive cycle of reward and punishment. When Nero was pleased with his wife, Sporus received gifts and attention, but when he failed in his role, the emperor's fury was unleashed. This toxic relationship kept Sporus trapped in a cycle of despair, where his worth came not from who he was, but from his ability to fulfill the whims of an emperor who did not see the young man as a person but as an object he could mold to his will. This total control not only affected Sporus' public life but also his mental and emotional health. Sporus' identity was completely stolen, replaced by one he never chose. What could have been a promising life turned into an existence of constant submission, a struggle to maintain his humanity while being shaped according to Nero's desires. Despite the fascinating facade of power and opulence that Nero maintained, his empire was on the brink of collapse. During the last years of his reign, the Romans began to see that Nero was not only losing the support of the court, but also of the very power base that had supported him. The nobility, generals, and even his own personal guard began to distrust his erratic leadership and increasingly unpredictable behavior. In 68 AD, the situation reached a point of no return. Rebellion spread throughout the empire, with entire provinces rising up against Nero. Political tensions, growing opposition, and widespread distrust in his government finally led the emperor to flee Rome, abandoning the city and his position of power. Amid this chaos, Sporus, who had been dragged into this spiral of madness and suffering, stood by Nero. Throughout the entire imperial disintegration, the young man remained the faithful companion of an emperor who no longer had control over his own destiny. Together, they fled, not only from enemies within Rome but from an empire that no longer recognized his leadership. Nero's fall was inevitable. When he was finally cornered and betrayed by those who had once been loyal to him, the emperor chose death over capture. Although his life came to an end, Sporus' nightmare did not. Nero, in his fall, left his wife as a reminder of what he once was, while the empire continued to crumble around him. Nero's death did not mean Sporus' liberation. Instead of regaining his freedom, the young man became a macabre trophy, an object of desire for the new emperors who came to power in the chaotic days following Nero's end. During the turbulent Year of the Four Emperors, Sporus was handed over to various rulers, each of whom treated him differently. Emperor Galba, the first to take power after Nero's death, took him as part of his possessions, keeping him in luxurious captivity, but without the freedom to decide his own fate. Later, Sporus was handed over to Emperor Otho, who, according to some sources, treated him with a certain form of respect. However, Otho's reign was short, and soon the power in Rome was assumed by Vitellius. It was during Vitellius' rule that Sporus' fate reached one of its darkest phases. Vitellius, known for his brutality and his desire for public demonstrations of power, devised a spectacle that would mark the end of Sporus' life. In an act as grotesque as it was repulsive, he planned to force Sporus to participate in a public reenactment of a historical event full of humiliations. This was the culmination of years of psychological and physical abuse, which had started under Nero and continued under the subsequent emperors. Sporus' life is undoubtedly one of the most tragic stories of Imperial Rome. From his encounter with Nero to his suffering under the yoke of the subsequent emperors, Sporus lived an existence that was imposed upon him, a life marked by the loss of his identity and freedom. The story of Sporus is not just the story of a man who suffered under tyranny, but of an entire system that allowed such atrocities to happen without question. Through this story, we are confronted with the true nature of absolute power, a power that not only controls the borders of an empire, but has the ability to destroy the very essence of a human being. Nero, like many others throughout history, used his power not only to dominate but to shape people to his will, creating human puppets to satisfy his desires and obsessions. However, beyond the darkness of Sporus' story, there is something we must remember. His life, although marked by suffering, was also a lesson in human resilience. In his final act of rebellion, Sporus made a final choice that, for a moment, returned control of his fate to him. In that act, he claimed the only thing he had left, the right to decide his own end. The story of Sporus should not be seen just as a tale of horror, but also as a reminder of the limitations of power and the resilience of the human spirit. In a world where figures of authority can manipulate and subjugate, dignity and the ability to resist remain a force that cannot be completely destroyed. So, what does the story of Sporus teach us? It invites us to reflect on the nature of power, the injustices that can arise when humanity is ignored, and, more importantly, how the tragedies of the past can help us better understand the present. If this story has impacted you, don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten tales of history, and leave us your opinion in the comments. What do you think about Nero's obsession and Sporus' suffering? Share your thoughts with us.